One man. One grave. More gold than the entire rest of the world combined. That sentence is not exaggerating. Not slightly. When archaeologists cracked open Grave 43 at the Varna Necropolis in Bulgaria in 1972, they found a single adult male buried with over 1.5 pounds of worked gold, rings, neck pieces, a gold penis sheath, and a gold-tipped war mace. Every other gold object found anywhere else on Earth from that same period, 4,560 BC, weighed less than what this one man took with him to the afterlife. He was not a pharaoh. He lived 2,000 years before Egypt's Old Kingdom. He was not a king in any sense you'd recognize. And yet, somehow, in a world where most humans still lived in small farming villages with roughly the same patch of land, the same clay pots, and the same hand tools, this one man ended up with everything. How? That question, what made one ancient human richer than another, is one of the most contested arguments in all of archaeology. And the answer, when you actually trace it from the evidence, is not what most people expect. It's not about who worked hardest. It's not even about who was smarter. By the time you understand what actually separated this man from his neighbors, you're going to look at your own situation with a completely different set of eyes. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand Grave 43, you need to understand what wealth even meant before this man existed. You are living in a hunter-gatherer group, somewhere in what will one day be Western Europe. It's around 10,000 BC. You own almost nothing. Not because you're poor, because ownership barely exists yet. You carry what you can carry. You share what comes in. The concept of storing wealth doesn't apply when your food rots in 3 days and your shelter is wherever you happen to stop. In this world, wealth is personal. It's your strength, your aim, your knowledge of where the deer run in spring. A 2014 study by researcher Coren Apicella, published in Evolution and Human Behavior, found that among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies, upper body strength was the single strongest predictor of a man's hunting reputation. And hunting reputation was the closest thing to wealth status that existed. You can't inherit upper body strength. Not exactly. Not in the way you inherit a bank account. That's the key. In a world where your wealth is your skill, each generation starts roughly even. Your son might be a worse hunter than you. Your neighbor's daughter might be a better forager than your daughter. Status rises and falls within a single lifetime. Doesn't lock in. Doesn't compound. Researchers confirmed this in 2010. A study led by Eric Alden Smith, published in the journal Current Anthropology, measured wealth inequality across multiple hunter-gatherer populations and found median Gini coefficients, the standard inequality measure, where 0 is perfect equality and 100 is one person owns everything, of around 17 to 25 for material wealth. That's close to perfect equality. For comparison, the United States today runs a Gini of roughly 85 for wealth. Hunter-gatherers weren't equal because they were noble. They were equal because the math of their survival didn't allow wealth to accumulate. Nothing to lock in. Nothing to pass down, reset every generation. Then, farming arrived. And the man in Grave 43 is what farming eventually produces. But here's where your assumptions probably lead you wrong. And this is the part I want you to sit with before the reversal, because the reversal only lands if you've built the wrong model first. You probably assume the first farmers who got richer did so by working harder, more disciplined, more forward-thinking. They planted more. They stored more. They skipped meals to save seed. And over time, their greater effort compounded into greater wealth. That story feels right. It feels American. Actually, it feels like the narrative your brain defaults to when you think about how wealth gets created. It's mostly wrong. Here's what the archaeological record actually shows. When farming first arrived in Western Eurasia, roughly 11,700 to 5,300 years ago, a period researchers now study as the early Neolithic, the Gini coefficients for wealth barely moved. A 2017 study led by Samuel Bowles at the Santa Fe Institute, published in Nature, applied Gini measurements to the house sizes of 63 archaeological sites worldwide. Early farming villages? Gini of around 35 to 40. Barely higher than the hunter-gatherers they replaced. Effort alone wasn't creating separation. Something else was. And it was coming. Drop a comment right now, before the answer, on what you think it was. One word. What's the thing that more than any other single factor made one ancient farmer richer than the person living next door? I'm going to tell you in about 2 minutes, and I'd bet money most of you are going to get it wrong. It wasn't harder work. It wasn't smarter trade. It wasn't even better land. It was an ox. Stay with me here. Around 7,000 years ago, late in the Neolithic period, something was introduced into farming communities across Eurasia that researchers at the Santa Fe Institute now call the robots of the late Neolithic. The ox-drawn plow. A single farmer with an ox team could cultivate 10 times more land than a hoe farmer working alone. 10 times. Same human, same hours in the day, 10 times the output. Overnight, the basic equation of survival changed. You were no longer limited by how many hours you could swing a hoe. You were limited by how much land you could command, and how many oxen you owned. Oxen cost money. Oxen required grazing land. Oxen were, in the ancient world, the startup capital without which you couldn't scale. If you had 2 oxen, you could work 20 fields. If your neighbor had 0 oxen, he could work 2 fields. You weren't working harder, you weren't smarter. You just had the machine. And he didn't. Now here's the part that makes this personal for you. Here's the if that changes everything. If your father had oxen, if you inherited an ox team, your starting position was 20 fields. Your neighbor's son, whose father had no oxen, started at 2. And that's where Grave 43 comes back into the picture. The man buried with all that gold at Varna in 4560 BC didn't live in the ox plow era, he was a little earlier than that, at the intersection of late Neolithic Copper Age wealth. But his existence is the early-stage preview of exactly this dynamic. The Varna Necropolis contains 294 graves. Archaeologists analyzed them. Most contain pottery, tools, a few small ornaments, roughly equal material. And then Grave 43. More gold than all others combined. Not a little more. Incomprehensibly more. What separated him from the person buried 40 feet away with a clay pot? In 2019, researchers at the Max Planck Institute in Jena published a landmark study in the journal Science. Archaeologist Alissa Mittnik and her team analyzed DNA, grave goods, and isotope data from over 100 individuals buried across 45 farmsteads in the Lech River Valley in southern Germany, covering about 700 years of Bronze Age society from roughly 2750 to 2050 BC. What they found was not subtle. Wealth ran in families, biological families, confirmed by DNA. The richest burials, men buried with bronze daggers, axes, and gold ornaments, shared genetic lineages stretching back 4 and 5 generations. Their infant children were buried with grave goods too, not because a 2-year-old accomplished something, because status was transmitted at birth. The women in these high-status households were often not from the local area. Isotope analysis showed some had traveled over 200 miles. They were brought in from elsewhere, likely as part of alliance building between powerful families. Their sons stayed and inherited. Their daughters left and were exchanged. Wealth was a biological inheritance system, not a merit system. Now here's the reversal. The thing that should rewire how you read this story. You've been watching this whole video with a quiet assumption running in the background. That the man in Grave 43 got there through something he did. That somewhere in his story there was a moment of decision or effort or brilliance that separated him from his neighbors. But the archaeological data doesn't support that. His wealth was almost certainly structural, not personal. He was born into a family that had accumulated the right assets at the right time, probably in the window when the ox plow or its equivalent first arrived in his region, and a small number of families locked in an advantage that compounded across generations. He didn't win the game. He was born on the winning team. And here's the uncomfortable modern mirror. A 2025 study led by Washington State University archaeologist Tim Kohler, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzed over 47,000 residential structures across 1,100 archaeological sites worldwide. The finding, wealth inequality consistently began increasing roughly 1,500 years after agriculture arrived in each region. Not immediately. Not at the moment of the first farm. But 1,500 years in, once the inheritance system had time to compound. 1.5 millennia of gradual head starts. That's what it took to build a Grave 43. If that just made you see something new, about ancient history, yes, but also about the world you're currently living and working inside, hit like. That's the kind of content that disappears if it doesn't get pushed. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. Because the animals get weirder than the ox. The Old World, Eurasia, had something the Americas didn't. Large domesticable animals. Cows, horses, pigs, sheep, goats. The Americas had dogs and turkeys. That's it. That's not a cultural difference. That's a geographic lottery result. And according to the Santa Fe Institute's Gini analysis, it produced a measurable difference in inequality across 2 entire hemispheres. The Aztec Empire, by any measure a highly hierarchical, often brutal civilization, had a Gini coefficient around 30 to 40 for residential wealth, roughly similar to Neolithic Europe. Meanwhile, Babylonia was hitting 46, and Roman Pompeii was measuring near 60. The Americas were, mathematically, more equal than the Old World. Not because of better governance or more enlightened culture. Because they didn't have draft animals that could be owned and inherited and used to multiply productive output 10 times over. The geography you were born into set the ceiling on how unequal your world could become, and the family you were born into determined where you stood inside that ceiling. So what does all this mean for you? Here's your choice fork. There are 2 ways to read the story of the man in Grave 43. The first reading says, he's an anomaly, a one-off product of ancient luck and circumstance. Interesting history. Doesn't apply. The second reading says, he is the first documented case of a pattern that has run continuously from 4,560 BC to the morning you woke up today. Wealth compounds. Tools multiply output. Whoever gets the tools first pulls away. Their children start ahead. Their grandchildren start further ahead still. The ox is different now. Now it's equity in a home your parents bought in 1987. Or a brokerage account that's been compounding since before you graduated. Or a professional network that opens doors you didn't know existed. The mechanism hasn't changed. The scale has. The math is identical. And here's the single piece of this that should actually change how you act, not just how you think. The period between the arrival of farming and the arrival of serious inequality in the Kohler study? 1,500 years. That's the window before the compounding locked in. The window where the ox hadn't yet separated the families who had it from the families who didn't. That window is where the game was actually still open. In your own life, that window is now. Before the tool compounds, before the asset appreciates, before the gap is too wide to close from this side. The man in grave 43 didn't start with all that gold. His family started with the first ox, or the first copper vein, or the first alliance with the right neighboring chieftain. One move, made early, in the right direction. And then, 1,500 years of math did the rest. The question I want you to answer below: what's the equivalent of the ox in your life right now? The thing you either have or are one decision away from acquiring that could multiply your output the way that animal multiplied theirs. Tell me. Because I think a lot of you know exactly what it is. And you've been staring at it for months without moving,